Sorry if I seem sick in this video, it's because I am. Today we're going to be talking about the fantasy genre, specifically the books and stories that shaped the genre from its conception to what it is today. Now, as far as what caused the fantasy genre's conception, it's an amalgamation of a lot of different things. So we're gonna go through the major influences of the beginnings of fantasy and then the major influences of where it went from there. This will not be an exhaustive list, but I sure did try. So much like any video like this that I've made has started, I have to begin with the truth that fantasy stories began farther back than we can historically track. Myths and folk tales and lore have always been a part of our oral traditions. Stories that have been passed down from person to person long before things started getting written down. And a lot of the things that we see in fantasy today were in those original myths and folklore. But as far as the first fantastical things ever to be written down, we have to look at the epics. Like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was recorded on tablets in Mesopotamia, the Greek myths like Perseus and Hercules, or the Scandinavian epic Beowulf. There's the legend of King Arthur, which has been told and retold so many times over the years. We have the Chinese novel Journey to the West, and many, many more. These epics were foundational in creating heroes and monsters and epic quests, exploring the questions like the meaning of life, the right way of living life, and the importance of speaking truth. Fantasy has always been about creatures and adventures, but it's also always been about asking essential questions and exploring those questions through the story. Moving on from the epics, the next major influence that I could find in my research on the fantasy genre was Shakespeare. In a time where literature needed to reflect reality and using fantasy within literature was generally frowned on and considered not acceptable or mature or worthy. During this time, you had Shakespeare creating plays like Macbeth with witches, Hamlet with ghosts, and A Midsummer's Night Dream with a world of fairies. And as I said in my video exploring the genre of horror, which you should totally check out, I loved making that video, Shakespeare was a massive influence on what is one of the most influential books on the horror and fantasy genre, The Castle of Otranto. This was published in 1764, and it was a trailblazer because he looked at Shakespeare and said, you can put fantasy in your stuff, surely I can in mine too. So he wrote this gothic novel about a man who had a prophecy on his life that their bloodline would end there. But quickly he tried to get married to prove that prophecy wrong, to escape the prophecy. But then a giant helmet, I think it was, anvil maybe, fell on his head and killed him immediately, and then the rest of the novel is the father of this man chasing the woman around, trying to impregnate her to make the prophecy not come true. Pretty dark. But anyway, this was instrumental because he took this fantastical, impossible element and placed it in this gothic story to be able to instigate what he wanted to do with his story. And this was a massive influence on the gothic genre, as well as shepherding fantasy into books that were considered acceptable, that were considered worthy. This book set up tropes like having a haunted or alive house, secret tunnels, and cursed families or individuals. This set up the gothic genre and was hugely influential. It also had that creepy, eerie tone that explored these fantastical, evil, scary things, but at its core had that message of the real monsters are the people, which is still a significant element in stories today. Fantasy is a necessary ingredient in living. It is a way of looking at life through the wrong end of a telescope, and that enables you to laugh at life's realities. Moving on to the 1800s, fairy tales had a massive resurge in popularity. I believe that kicked off with the Grimm's fairy tales, which were stories that were passed down orally for hundreds and hundreds of years, and finally two brothers sat down and started writing them out, and their versions of these stories have they still are the staple of how we view a lot of these stories, even though they've probably changed a lot before they got to this point. Following that, we had Hans Christian Andersen and his short stories, stuff like The Nutcracker and Undine, which were instrumental as well, even all the way down to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and so many more. But as far as the first fairy tale that was published as an actual novel, we have Phantasmium by Sarah Coleridge, which was almost didn't get published because nobody believed in it, because the idea of a fairy tale, which is meant to be short and for children, to be made into an actual novel, to be expanded on that much and then published for all to read, was a novel concept. This was published in 1837. Then, just a few years later, in 1858, we have Phantastes by George MacDonald. The gist of this novel is that a young man is pulled into a fantasy world where he searches for the female befitting his standards of perfection. I know it sounds awesome, but this was the first fantasy novel written down that it was exclusively for adults and not at all for children. I don't know how Sarah Coleridge's book was marketed, if it was for children and adults or how that works, but I know that his was definitively written for adults. It was the first, at least that I could find in my research, the first portal fantasy that was ever published, and it was massively, massively, massively influential to authors such as C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, J.M. Barrie, Lewis Carroll. A lot of people have cited him as their inspiration for their own works. While other fantasy stories did come out before this one, he was a trailblazer and he influenced the genre heavily, not only in bringing portal fantasy to us, but also in that he wanted to carve out a space in the fantasy genre specifically for adults. I write not for children, but for the childlike, whether they be 5 or 50 or 75. Next up, we have William Morris, whose first book, The House of the Wolfings, was published in 1889, and he was the first author to publish a novel that was set in a world entirely independent of our own. Not that it was partially set in our world and partially set in another world. It was entirely, he made up a whole new world, and that was the entirety of the book. He also would write fantasy with poems intertwined, and he was cited as a massive giant influence for Tolkien as well, even more so than MacDonald. Tolkien has written several letters actually talking about how massive of an influence he was to him. Speaking of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, next up in 1937, Tolkien published The Hobbit, and following that, he then published The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien introduced high fantasy to us, extensive worlds that felt lived in, that were well fleshed out, that felt bigger than the story that we were in. He made maps, invented mythology and languages. He really set the landscape for fantasy that could be epic. Of course, I did talk about the epics before this, which were certainly epic as well, but I mean, a novel of fantasy for a, you know what I'm sure you get it. While both of these authors were heavily influenced by authors already mentioned in this video, they both set the landscape for fantasy in many, many ways. They captured their audiences on a whole new level. They popularized fantasy as a novel medium in a whole new way. And their influence, especially Tolkien's influence, shaped the genre for years and years and years and years to come. We have many very popular and well-respected books that are heavily influenced by Tolkien, stuff like The Sword of Shannara, Wheel of Time, and many more. And you can see the massive influences of The Lord of the Rings on books still published today. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. Next, it should be noted that the term fantasy wasn't actually widely used during any of these things that I've just cited, except for Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, the word fantasy wasn't actually popularized until 1940, and it became popularized through magazines, such as the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and Weird Tales, which published fantasy and horror stories, and writers such as H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard were all regular contributors. And now we get to the more modern influences on the genre. These will all be more familiar to us, so I'll get through them a little bit more quickly. Much like the Castle of Otranto, which was technically a gothic horror, but brought in fantasy influences to it, 3 books, modern books that were massively influential in shaping the sci fantasy genre are The Dragon Riders of Perrin, published in 1967, which was the first novel where dragons could communicate with humans. We have The Wizard of Earthsea in 1968, which popularized the magical school, and Kindred of 1979, which was a time travel book whose purpose was to take a hard look at slavery, master and slave dynamics, and have a strong social critique on history, and to this day is still taught in many schools as part of the curriculum. Taking fantasy elements as well as science fiction elements and mashing them together and using that to have some sort of discussion or critique on society and humanity is a very big theme in sci-fi in general. But as far as I could tell in my research, these 3 novels heavily popularized, they weren't the first to do it, but heavily popularized, melding these genres together and having these discussions here. Fantasy gives me a means to write more closely to theme, unfettered by the constrictions of the real world, more or less, enabling me to make my own constrictions that will guide the story down thematic paths. And then we move into more modern books. Some very notable influences on the genre are A Song of Ice and Fire, which is not the first grimdark, but certainly opened the door to grimdark in more common media spaces. This made authors like N.K. Jemisin, Joe Abercrombie, Stephen Erickson be able to thrive in this space even more. And then of course you have stories like Harry Potter and Twilight, which heavily popularized fiction within the young adult sphere. Fiction aimed at teens was suddenly something that everybody was reading and really opened the door for a lot of modern teens. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I've obviously skipped over a lot of heavy influences. My goal was to find the novels that really shaped the genre into what it is today, and in order to keep this video of a reasonable length, I had to pick and choose. But for those of you who are very passionate about this topic and have done a lot of your own research on it, please feel free to correct me or add to what I've said in the comments. Fantasy is a genre that takes fantastical creatures and elements and worlds and gives us the opportunity to remove ourselves from our everyday lives and examine a lot of our core questions and ideals and what ifs in a unique setting. Fantasy isn't only escapism, it's discussions, it's hard looks at humanity and society. And yeah, it's also escapism, and really great escapism. A few years ago, I was in the middle of reading The Lord of the Rings, and this story, while I love it on its own, I think it's phenomenal, fantastic, amazing, it kind of became a refuge to me when I was going through a really hard time and having to process a lot of tough emotions. It kind of became my safe haven. I went to Middle Earth when I needed to get away from here. I explored a new land, I struggled with the characters, I developed a brotherhood and camaraderie with them, and that story is kind of cemented in my mind as something even more special because of the refuge that it was for me in that time. But fantasy does many things, including starting and continuing important discussions. Fantasy is an awesome genre, and I love it. And I thought it was kind of interesting to look into where it started and how it was shaped. Again, there's a lot more that could be cited for how it was shaped, so for those of you who are very passionate about this topic, please feel free to add to this video in the comments. For those of you who haven't looked into this, I hope you found this interesting. And if you're interested in keeping up with what I'm currently reading, I have a second channel that's dedicated to reading vlogs where I give little reviews and discussions of what I'm reading, as well as more in-depth discussions all over on my second channel, which is always linked in the description of this video. I post videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on this channel, Tuesdays and Thursdays on the second channel. I'll see you again soon. Bye.